In the frozen wilderness of Siberia, where the wind cuts through flesh like a blade and survival depends on strength most men never possess, a peasant boy was born who would one day hold the fate of an entire empire in his calloused hands. This is the story of a man who survived a knife to the gut, bullets to the chest, poison in his wine, and a freezing river that should have claimed his life. A man whose very existence would topple dynasties and reshape the course of history. His name was Grigori Rasputin, and by the time you finish this video, you'll understand why they called him the man who wouldn't die. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing about this story. Everything you think you know about Rasputin's death is probably wrong. The legendary tale of cyanide-laced cakes, multiple gunshots, and a desperate crawl across a frozen courtyard. Modern forensic analysis has blown holes through that entire narrative. The truth is far more disturbing than the myth, and it reveals something terrifying about human nature and the lengths people will go to protect their power. I'm going to walk you through the real story of Rasputin's rise, from a dirt-poor peasant to the most powerful man in Russia, his supernatural ability to cheat death, and the shocking truth about his final assassination that historians kept hidden for over a century. But first, let me show you just how dramatically one man can change the course of world history. Picture this. It's 1869, and in a remote Siberian village called Pokrovskoye, where Europe meets Asia and civilization barely exists, a child is born to peasant parents who have absolutely no idea they've just brought the future destroyer of the Russian Empire into the world. This village sits along the Tura River, flowing eastward from the Ural Mountains, and life here is about as basic as it gets. No electricity, no running water, no hope of escape from the crushing poverty that defines every single day. Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin seemed destined for the most ordinary life imaginable. His father was a peasant farmer, his mother worked the fields, and young Grigori was expected to follow the same path that every generation of his family had walked before him. The kid got into some trouble with local authorities for unruly behavior, but nothing that suggested he would one day hold the lives of Russian royalty in his hands. But here's where the story takes its first dramatic turn. At age 28, when most men in his village were already broken down by hard labor and resigned to their fate, Rasputin experienced what can only be described as a complete spiritual transformation. In 1897, he embarked on a pilgrimage to a monastery that would fundamentally change not just his own life, but the destiny of an entire nation. What happened during that pilgrimage remains a mystery. But when Rasputin returned, he was no longer the same man. He had transformed from an ordinary peasant into what Russians called a strannik, a wandering pilgrim seeking spiritual truth. This wasn't just some casual religious phase. Rasputin had discovered something that would become his greatest weapon, an almost supernatural ability to read people, to understand their deepest fears and desires, and to tell them exactly what they needed to hear. Now, you have to understand the context here. This is early 1900s Russia, where superstition and mysticism weren't just common. They were woven into the very fabric of society. The Russian Orthodox Church held enormous power, but there was also this underground world of faith, healers, mystics, and holy men who claimed to possess divine gifts. Into this world stepped Rasputin, and he was about to prove that he was different from all the rest. In 1903, this Siberian peasant made a decision that would change world history. He traveled to St. Petersburg, the glittering capital of the Russian Empire, where Tsar Nicholas II ruled over 130 million people. But Rasputin didn't just show up and demand an audience with the royal family. That's not how you survive in a world where one wrong word can get you exiled to the frozen wasteland of Siberia forever. Instead, Rasputin began working his way up the social ladder with the kind of strategic brilliance that would make modern politicians jealous. He captivated religious leaders with his intense spiritual fervor and his ability to quote scripture in ways that seemed to pierce straight through to people's souls. He formed friendships with members of the aristocracy, particularly two women known as the Black Princesses, Militsa and Anastasia of Montenegro, who had married into the royal family. These women became absolutely fascinated by Rasputin's charisma and his claims of divine power. But more importantly, they had direct access to Tsar Nicholas II, and his wife, Empress Alexandra. And here's what makes this story so incredible. By 1905, just 2 years after arriving in St. Petersburg as a nobody from Siberia, Rasputin was standing face to face with the most powerful man in Russia. The meeting took place at the Peterhof Palace on the 1st of November 1905. The Tsar himself recorded the event in his diary, writing that he and Alexandra had made the acquaintance of a man of God, Grigori, from Tobolsk province. But this wasn't just a polite introduction. As Nicholas wrote to one of his ministers a year later, "A few days ago, I received a peasant from the Tobolsk district, Grigori Rasputin, who brought me an icon of Saint Simeon of Verkhoturye. He made a remarkably strong impression both on Her Majesty and on myself, so that instead of 5 minutes, our conversation went on for more than an hour." Think about that for a moment. A peasant from the middle of nowhere had so impressed the Emperor and Empress of Russia that they spent an hour in deep conversation with him. What kind of person has that level of magnetic charisma? What did Rasputin say or do that made two of the most powerful people on earth want to keep talking to him? The answer lies in Rasputin's almost supernatural ability to understand human psychology. The imperial couple had consulted spiritual advisors before, but Rasputin surpassed all their expectations with his uncanny ability to discern their deepest hopes and fears. He told Nicholas exactly what he needed to hear about having more confidence as Tsar. He soothed Alexandra's anxieties about ruling an empire, but most crucially, he was about to demonstrate a power that would make him absolutely indispensable to the royal family. Because here's what very few people know about the Russian royal family in 1905. They were hiding a devastating secret that could have destroyed the monarchy if it had become public knowledge. Their only son and heir to the throne, Alexei Nikolaevich, was suffering from a condition that was slowly killing him. Alexei had hemophilia, inherited from his mother's side of the family through the line of Queen Victoria of Britain. This wasn't just any medical condition. This was a death sentence. When Alexei's umbilical cord was cut at birth, his navel bled for hours because his blood couldn't clot. Nicholas wrote in horror that his son lost 1/8 to 1/9 of his total blood volume in just 48 hours. Any small injury could trigger internal bleeding that might kill the future Tsar of Russia. The royal doctors were completely helpless. This was 1906, and medical science had no effective treatment for hemophilia. The imperial family watched in agony as their son suffered through bleeding episodes that left him screaming in pain, delirious with fever, and often close to death. They had tried everything, the best doctors in Europe, experimental treatments, desperate prayers, but nothing worked until Rasputin arrived. In late 1906, when Alexei was having another life-threatening bleeding episode, Empress Alexandra made a decision that would change the course of world history. In absolute desperation, she asked this Siberian peasant to help her dying son. What happened next defied all medical explanation and cemented Rasputin's position as the most powerful man in Russia. Rasputin walked into that room where the young Tsarevich lay dying, and what he did next has baffled doctors and historians for over a century. He didn't perform elaborate rituals or chant mysterious incantations. He simply looked at the boy, placed his hands on him, and spoke in his deep, hypnotic voice. Within hours, the bleeding stopped. The fever broke. Alexei began to recover. The royal doctors were stunned. Dr. S.P. Fedorov, one of the physicians attending Alexei, later admitted that the recovery was wholly inexplicable from a medical point of view. But here's what's even more incredible. This wasn't a one-time miracle. Again and again, when Alexei faced life-threatening bleeding episodes, Rasputin would somehow bring him back from the brink of death. The most famous incident happened in 1912 during what became known as the Crisis at Spawa. The royal family was at their hunting lodge when Alexei suffered a devastating internal hemorrhage after a jolting carriage ride. A massive hematoma formed in his thigh and groin. The boy was delirious with pain, running a high fever, and the doctors prepared the family for the worst. They literally thought the heir to the Russian throne was going to die. In absolute desperation, Empress Alexandra sent a telegram to Rasputin, who was back home in Siberia. She begged him to pray for her son. Rasputin's response was immediate and confident. God has seen your tears and heard your prayers. Do not grieve. The little one will not die. Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much." The next day, Alexei's bleeding stopped completely. His fever disappeared. Within weeks, he was playing again, as if nothing had happened. Dr. Fedorov, the same physician who had been baffled by Rasputin's earlier success, made an admission that reveals just how extraordinary this was. Rasputin would come in, walk up to the patient, look at him, and spit. The bleeding would stop in no time. How could the Empress not trust Rasputin after that? Now, modern medical experts have theories about what was really happening here. Some believe Rasputin's insistence that doctors leave Alexei alone was accidentally brilliant. The wonder drug of the time was aspirin, which we now know thins the blood, and would have made hemophilia symptoms far worse. Others think Rasputin used hypnosis to calm the boy, which could have helped control bleeding by reducing stress and blood pressure. But here's what you have to understand. None of that mattered to Empress Alexandra. To her, this peasant from Siberia was literally saving her son's life through divine intervention. Rasputin had made himself absolutely indispensable to the most powerful family in Russia, and he knew exactly how to leverage that position. Because Rasputin wasn't just some simple holy man stumbling through the corridors of power, this guy was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. He understood that his ability to help Alexei gave him unprecedented access to the imperial family, but more importantly, he realized that access could be converted into real political influence. As the years passed, Rasputin's hold over the royal family grew stronger and stronger. He wasn't just the person they called when Alexei was sick. He became Alexandra's most trusted advisor on everything. She started consulting him about government appointments, military strategy, even foreign policy. And here's the truly mind-blowing part. Rasputin had no formal education, no political experience, no understanding of how to run an empire, yet he was effectively helping to govern 130 million people. The Russian aristocracy watched this transformation with growing horror. Imagine being a highly educated nobleman with centuries of family tradition in government service, only to see some unwashed peasant from the middle of nowhere whispering in the Empress's ear about matters of state. The resentment was building like pressure in a boiler, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time before something explosive happened. But Rasputin seemed completely oblivious to the danger, or maybe he just didn't care. His behavior became increasingly outrageous as his power grew. He would show up to high society parties, drunk and disheveled, making crude jokes and inappropriate advances toward aristocratic women. He boasted about his influence over the royal family. He accepted bribes from people seeking government positions. The man who had once been a devout pilgrim was now living like a corrupt medieval king. The breaking point came in 1914, and it arrived in the most violent way possible. Rasputin was back home in his Siberian village, taking a break from the political intrigue of St. Petersburg, when he decided to visit the local post office. It was July 12th, a perfectly ordinary Sunday afternoon. He had just received a telegram and was walking out to send a reply when a woman approached him on the street. Her name was Kionia Guseva, and she was carrying a long knife hidden beneath her dress. Guseva was a deeply disturbed individual. Her face had been horribly disfigured, possibly by syphilis, and she blamed Rasputin for all the evil in the world. She was a follower of Iliador, another controversial religious figure who had once been Rasputin's friend but had turned into his bitter enemy. As Rasputin emerged from the post office, Guseva struck without warning. She drove the knife deep into his abdomen, then screamed, "I have killed the Antichrist." But here's where Rasputin's legendary resilience first became apparent. Instead of collapsing and dying like any normal person would after being stabbed in the gut, he somehow found the strength to fight back. What happened next was like something out of a nightmare. Guseva chased Rasputin through the streets of his own village, trying to finish what she had started while he stumbled and bled, desperately seeking help. The wound was severe. The knife had penetrated deep into his abdomen, causing massive internal damage. Any reasonable person would have died within minutes. But Rasputin didn't die. He was rushed to a hospital in the nearby city of Tumen, where surgeons worked frantically to save his life. The operation was successful, and after weeks of recovery, Rasputin walked out of that hospital very much alive. The first attempt to kill the man who wouldn't die had failed spectacularly. News of the assassination attempt spread throughout Russia like wildfire. To Rasputin's supporters, his survival was proof of his divine protection. To his enemies, it was evidence that he was some kind of supernatural monster who couldn't be killed by normal means. Either way, the legend of Rasputin's invincibility was born, and it would only grow stronger in the years to come. But this was just the beginning. The knife attack in 1914 was merely a preview of the far more dramatic and ultimately successful assassination attempt that would come 2 years later. And when that final confrontation arrived, it would involve some of the most powerful people in Russia, a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of the royal family, and a death scene so bizarre that forensic experts are still debating what really happened over a century later. Because while Rasputin had survived the first attempt on his life, his enemies were learning something important. If you want to kill a man who seems impossible to kill, you don't send one disturbed woman with a kitchen knife. You need multiple conspirators, multiple weapons, and a plan so thorough that even supernatural intervention can't save your target. The stage was being set for one of history's most famous murders, and this time, Rasputin's legendary ability to cheat death would be put to the ultimate test. The year 1914 marked a turning point not just for Rasputin, but for the entire world. As he was recovering from Guseva's knife attack in that Siberian hospital, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was being assassinated in Sarajevo, setting off a chain reaction that would plunge Europe into the most devastating war the world had ever seen. And here's the cruel irony. While World War I would destroy millions of ordinary lives, it would elevate Rasputin to heights of power that even he probably never imagined possible. When Tsar Nicholas made the fateful decision in 1915 to leave St. Petersburg and personally command the Russian army at the front, he unknowingly handed the keys to his empire to two people who were completely unqualified to rule: his German-born wife Alexandra and a Siberian peasant who had never held any official government position in his life. This wasn't just a temporary arrangement. Nicholas would spend most of the next 2 years at military headquarters, leaving domestic affairs entirely in their hands. The results were catastrophic beyond anything you could imagine. Picture this. While Russian soldiers were dying by the hundreds of thousands on the Eastern Front, back in the capital, government ministers were being hired and fired based on the recommendations of a man who couldn't even read properly. Rasputin's influence over Alexandra had grown so complete that she consulted him on virtually every major decision affecting the Russian Empire, and Rasputin was loving every minute of it. The power had gone completely to his head. He started demanding massive bribes from anyone seeking government appointments. He would show up to important meetings drunk and disheveled, treating government ministers like servants. The man who had once been a humble pilgrim was now acting like he owned Russia, because in many ways, he actually did. The appointments that Rasputin influenced during this period read like a catalogue of incompetence and corruption. He pushed for Boris Sturmer to become prime minister, a man so widely despised that even his own party members considered him unfit for office. He championed Alexander Protopopov as Minister of the Interior, despite the fact that Protopopov was showing clear signs of mental illness and had no relevant experience for the position. These weren't just bad personnel decisions, they were actively destroying the Russian state's ability to function. While the country desperately needed competent leadership to manage the war effort, feed the population, and maintain basic order, Rasputin was installing his cronies in positions of power based on personal loyalty rather than ability. The bureaucracy that had held the Russian Empire together for centuries was collapsing from within. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. Rasputin wasn't even trying to hide what he was doing. He would openly brag about his influence over the Empress. He told anyone who would listen that he could make or break careers with a single word to Alexandra. The man had become so drunk on power that he seemed to forget he was still just a peasant from Siberia, who could be destroyed if the wrong people decided he had gone too far. And those wrong people were definitely paying attention. By 1916, the Russian aristocracy was in full panic mode. They could see that the empire was falling apart, that the war was going disastrously, and that public opinion was turning against the royal family. But instead of blaming the fundamental problems with Russia's political and economic system, they focused their rage on one man, the peasant, who seemed to be controlling their empress like a puppet master. The whispers started in the salons of St. Petersburg and spread throughout the highest levels of Russian society. Rasputin had to go, not just removed from influence, he had to die, because by this point, everyone understood that Alexandra would never willingly give up her advisor, the man she believed was divinely ordained to protect her son and guide her decisions. The only way to break Rasputin's hold over the royal family was to eliminate him permanently. The conspiracy that formed around this idea wasn't some ragtag group of desperate revolutionaries. These were some of the most powerful and influential people in the Russian Empire. Prince Felix Yusupov, married to the Tsar's own niece and heir to one of Russia's greatest fortunes. Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, the Tsar's cousin and a member of the royal family itself. Vladimir Purishkevich, a prominent member of the Duma and a respected conservative politician. These men convinced themselves they were patriots saving Russia from destruction. In their minds, Rasputin was a cancer that had to be cut out before it killed the entire body of the empire. They believed that once he was gone, Nicholas and Alexandra would come to their senses, competent ministers would be appointed, and Russia could still win the war and preserve the monarchy. What they didn't understand was that they were about to make the situation infinitely worse. Because killing Rasputin wouldn't solve any of Russia's fundamental problems, it would just remove the one person who might have been able to influence Alexandra to make more moderate decisions. But these aristocratic conspirators were so focused on their hatred of this upstart peasant that they couldn't see the bigger picture. Felix Yusupov became the leader of the plot, and his motivations were particularly complex. Here was a man who had been born into unimaginable wealth and privilege, married into the royal family, and yet felt completely powerless as he watched his country falling apart. Killing Rasputin would be his chance to finally matter, to be remembered as the man who saved Russia from its greatest internal threat. The plan they developed was elaborate and dramatic, befitting men who saw themselves as the heroes of a grand historical drama. Yusupov would invite Rasputin to his palace under the pretense of introducing him to his wife, Princess Irina, who was supposedly eager to meet the famous holy man. Once Rasputin arrived, they would poison him with cyanide-laced food and wine. If the poison somehow failed, they had backup plans involving guns and whatever other violence might be necessary. But here's what makes this story so fascinating. Almost everything we think we know about what happened next is completely wrong. The dramatic tale that has captivated people for over a century, with its multiple murder attempts and Rasputin's supernatural resistance to death, is largely a fabrication created by the killers themselves to make their crime seem more justified and themselves seem more heroic. On the night of the 29th of December 1916, Felix Yusupov sent a message to Rasputin asking him to come to the Yusupov palace. The invitation claimed that Princess Irina was there and wanted to meet him, though in reality she was hundreds of miles away. Rasputin, despite all his political cunning, walked straight into what should have been an obvious trap. Why would a man who had survived multiple assassination attempts and had countless enemies be so careless? The answer reveals something crucial about Rasputin's psychology. Despite all the hatred directed toward him, despite the growing calls for his removal, he had become so convinced of his own invincibility that he genuinely believed nothing could harm him. The knife attack in 1914 had only reinforced his sense that he was under divine protection. So, on that freezing December night, Rasputin made his way through the snow-covered streets of St. Petersburg to the Yusupov palace, completely unaware that he was walking to his death. He was dressed in his typical peasant clothes, carrying his usual walking stick, probably thinking this was just another opportunity to expand his influence among the aristocracy. What happened when he arrived at the palace has been the subject of intense debate for over a century. According to Yusupov's later account, which became the basis for countless books and movies, Rasputin was led down to a basement room that had been specially prepared for the occasion. The conspirators had laid out an elaborate spread of cakes and wine, all supposedly laced with enough cyanide to kill several men instantly. Yusupov claimed that he watched in horror as Rasputin consumed cake after cake and glass after glass of poisoned wine, showing absolutely no ill effects whatsoever. According to this version of events, the cyanide that should have killed him within minutes had no impact at all, as if Rasputin's body was somehow immune to poison. Growing desperate, Yusupov supposedly left the room to consult with his fellow conspirators, then returned with a revolver borrowed from Grand Duke Dmitri. He shot Rasputin in the chest at close range, and the holy man finally collapsed. Convinced that their target was dead, the conspirators began planning how to dispose of the body. But then, according to Yusupov's dramatic retelling, something impossible happened. Rasputin's eyes suddenly opened. He lunged at Yusupov with superhuman strength, clawing at his face and throat. The supposedly dead man somehow found the energy to break free and began crawling toward the palace courtyard, apparently trying to escape. Purishkevich, hearing the commotion, ran outside and fired several more shots at the fleeing figure. Rasputin finally collapsed in the snow, but even then the conspirators weren't convinced he was truly dead. They beat him with clubs and kicked him repeatedly before finally wrapping his body in a carpet and driving to the Neva River. The final element of this legendary account claims that when they threw Rasputin's body through a hole in the ice, he was still alive. According to this version, the autopsy later revealed water in his lungs, proving that the man who had survived poison and multiple gunshots had ultimately drowned beneath the frozen river. It's an absolutely incredible story, and it perfectly fits the legend of Rasputin as a man who was literally impossible to kill. The problem is, modern forensic analysis has proven that virtually none of it actually happened the way Yusupov described. Here's what really happened on that December night in 1916, based on the physical evidence and contemporary medical reports that the conspirators couldn't falsify. When Rasputin's body was recovered from the Neva River 3 days later, the autopsy revealed a single gunshot wound to the forehead, fired at extremely close range. There was no evidence of poisoning in his system. There was no water in his lungs indicating drowning. The man had been executed with a single bullet to the head, probably while he was standing face to face with his killer. So why did Yusupov create this elaborate fiction about poison that didn't work, and a man who wouldn't die? The answer reveals something disturbing about human nature and the stories we tell ourselves to justify our actions. These aristocratic conspirators needed to believe they had killed a monster, not just murdered an unarmed man. The more superhuman they could make Rasputin seem, the more heroic their actions appeared. But the truth is far more chilling than the myth. Rasputin walked into that palace as a human being with human vulnerabilities, and he was killed by other human beings who had convinced themselves they were saving their country. There was nothing supernatural about his death, just cold-blooded murder, carried out by people who believed their social status gave them the right to decide who lived and who died. The irony is that by creating this elaborate myth about Rasputin's supernatural powers, the conspirators actually made him more powerful in death than he had ever been in life. The legend of the man who wouldn't die has outlasted the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and every other institution that existed in 1916. People around the world still know Rasputin's name, while most of his killers have been forgotten by history. And here's the final, devastating irony of this entire story. And the murder that was supposed to save the Russian monarchy actually sealed its doom. When news of Rasputin's murder spread through St. Petersburg on New Year's Day 1917, the conspirators expected to be hailed as heroes who had finally freed Russia from its greatest internal threat. Instead, they discovered they had made a catastrophic miscalculation that would accelerate the very destruction they had tried to prevent. Tsar Nicholas II's reaction to his cousin's involvement in the assassination revealed just how completely the royal family had isolated themselves from reality. Instead of thanking the conspirators for removing what most of his subjects saw as a corrupting influence, Nicholas was furious that members of his own family had participated in murder. He exiled Grand Duke Dmitri to the Persian front and placed Felix Yusupov under house arrest on his family estates. But the damage went far deeper than the Tsar's personal anger. Empress Alexandra, already devastated by the loss of the man she believed was her son's divine protector, now viewed the aristocracy as her mortal enemies. If the nobility could murder Rasputin, who was to say they wouldn't come for her family next? Her paranoia and isolation from Russian society, already extreme, became absolute. The conspirators had fundamentally misunderstood the political dynamics they were trying to change. They believed that removing Rasputin would somehow restore the monarchy's credibility and allow Russia to win the war. What they failed to grasp was that Rasputin wasn't the cause of Russia's problems. He was a symptom of a rotting system that had lost the confidence of its people. Without Rasputin's moderating influence over Alexandra, the Empress became even more erratic in her decision-making. The government appointments became more chaotic, not less. The disconnect between the royal family and Russian society widened into an unbridgeable chasm. The murder that was supposed to save the monarchy had instead removed one of the few remaining threads holding it together. Within weeks of Rasputin's death, the situation in St. Petersburg began spiraling completely out of control. Food shortages that had been manageable became critical. Labor strikes that had been sporadic became constant. Military units that had remained loyal began questioning their orders. The Russian people, exhausted by 3 years of devastating war and incompetent leadership, were reaching their breaking point. By March 1917, just 3 months after Rasputin's murder, revolution erupted in the streets of St. Petersburg. The Tsar, who had once ruled over 130 million people, was forced to abdicate, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule. The royal family that Rasputin had served, protected, and ultimately corrupted was imprisoned, and within a year they would all be dead, executed in a basement by Bolshevik revolutionaries. The peasant from Siberia, who seemed impossible to kill, had indeed died that December night in 1916, but his death unleashed forces that would prove far more destructive than anything he had done while alive. The conspirators who murdered him, believing they were saving Russia, had instead delivered the final blow to the empire they claimed to love. So here's the ultimate truth about Rasputin, the man who wouldn't die. His greatest power wasn't surviving assassination attempts or healing a sick child. His true supernatural ability was becoming more influential in death than he ever was in life. Over a century later, we're still talking about him, still trying to separate the man from the myth, still fascinated by this peasant who rose from nothing to reshape the destiny of nations. The legend of Rasputin endures because it reveals something profound about power, about the stories we tell ourselves, and about how a single individual can change the course of history in ways no one could ever predict. He really was the man who wouldn't die, not because bullets couldn't kill him, but because his story became immortal.